Thanks, Rob. As Marty introduced me a little bit before, my name's Allison Simons. I'm an assistant director here and I manage the country programs that has been mentioned several times before. As Marty and Rob have mentioned, there are a number of different development through sport investments in the Pacific. And since this program was designed to be able to complement those existing activities, I thought it would be important to give you guys a bit of a history of the Pacific Country Programs and where they've started and how they've evolved over the years. In 2005, there was an announcement by John Howard around sport and providing sport funding to the Pacific Islands. It was a political gesture meant to make friends and influence people. And the thought behind that was that sport was inherently good, that there were good things that came out of sport. Participating in sport was good for people, it was good for children. And if we just focused on doing sport in the Pacific, that we would get some development outcomes, some sort of outcomes out of that. The programs were designed in consultation with AusAid, but as Rob has indicated, sport is, seen as, although it's seen as a good thing, not necessarily seen as a driving factor within AusAid. So mostly we were left to our own devices to design a program that used sport to give inherent benefits and didn't really call out necessarily what those benefits were going to be. There was no real strategy towards it at the time. The programs the countries that were selected at the time were Samoa, Vanuatu, Fiji, Nauru and Kiribati. And the partners that were selected in consultation with AusAid were government partners, and in most cases ministries of sport, or ministries responsible for sport. Often, as many of you would know, ministries there isn't ministries for sport in many of these Pacific countries. They're usually quite a small aspect and form part of either ministries of health or ministries of internal affairs. And they were selected as our main partners at the time, which as we'll progress through my slides, we'll see that has been a bit of a challenge to the program for development outcomes, because a lot of these partners, government partners, were not used to actually implementing programs on the ground. They were really focused on policy, so they had very little capacity to actually implement programs, and also, being such a small aspect of the government, didn't have a lot of buy-in for the rest of the development efforts in the country. The approach at the beginning was really strengths-based approach, which was really about working on the strengths of existing partners and the strengths in existing communities, and letting communities decide what development outcome was most important to them. It was very community-led, and there was a real focus on working in rural areas. There was a feeling back when the programs were designed that there was some access to sport in urban areas, but the rural areas could really benefit from sport development. Then in 2009, we had another announcement by then Prime Minister Rudd at the Pacific Island Forum. And that was the first announcement of the PSP, and it was also an announcement of the extension and expansion of the ASOP Country Programs. Two further countries were added to the existing 5, and those were Tonga and Solomon Islands. And as part of that funding was about increasing the funding to the existing partners, and so staying then with the government partners, and also expanding into the other countries, and it became more apparent then that the focus wasn't necessarily on working with governments, that we could find other partners. And in the case of the Solomon Islands, we actually partnered with an NGO with Save the Children. The approach, however, was still very similar. Although there was more of a shift towards sport for development and having real development outcomes associated with the programs, it was still very much a strengths-based approach, very much community-led. Communities chose what sports they wanted to do and how they wanted to work with those. And there was still a large focus on expanding outside of urban areas. And that's when PSP first began. And for a bunch of various reasons, there was limited coordination between the country programs and PSP, in no small part due to the fact that the country programs were still very much in their early stages of development and weren't really necessarily appropriate partners for the sports at the time. Then in 2010, 2011, there was a shift in the focus towards very much more towards development outcomes and the necessity to have development outcomes and to be really targeted in what we were actually trying to do. There was a refocus of activities towards specific development outcomes, and there was a push to expand the programs to extend our reach. That there was, at that stage, the programs were ready to expand into large areas and not just remain so contained to the small areas in which we were working before. The approach, as I said, was much more directed towards the specific development outcomes, and in this particular case, we now announced the development outcomes that we were actually going to achieve were improved health-related behaviours, improved inclusion, and by inclusion I mean people with disability, women and girls, and improved social cohesion. These outcomes were what we felt at the time were our best buys. If we invested really heavily in this, based on the evidence of what we have already coming out of the programs, these are our areas where we can have the most impact. So we decided to focus on those three. Then the collaboration with PSP was really improved, started to improve during this time when we saw that there was some synergies between the two programs and that we could work a lot better together. And I'll give you a few examples later on, but the Tonga program was the first that really showed how the collaboration between PSP and the sport and the country programs could really work. And during that time was also the launch of the ASOP Monitoring, Evaluation and Research Project, which is when we focused on improving monitoring evaluation. As Rob has said, monitoring and evaluation is very important for AusAid. We had monitoring evaluation in place, but it wasn't consistent, and it was really good in some places and not so good in others. So we really wanted a consistent approach to our monitoring evaluation across the country programs. We also committed to doing a once-off independent evaluation of those programs, which will happen next year. And there was a research program, which is really around getting the evidence that AusAid needs, that really strong evidence about the value of sport, to be able to feed in to AusAid's, to the story about sport and what sport can actually contribute in the development space. And then as Marty has spoken, in 2012 is when we started to put together the joint strategy between AusAid and the ASC that would really call out what exactly are we actually trying to target. And we had those two main development outcomes that both Rob and Marty have alluded to, with the non-communicable disease or the health outcomes and the disability outcomes. And there are obviously those cross-cutting gender and social cohesion outcomes as well. So it's a nice, neat fit it's not really changed much from what we had in 2010, 2011, but really focusing towards those two outcomes. And obviously there's been now a focus on really aligning our investments. So looking at all our different investments in the Pacific and seeing how we can best get them to work together, since we're all working in the same field, and in the Pacific they're fairly small countries really, so you want to make sure that you're aligning your investments. Okay, so the opportunities for sport. Look, a lot of the detail about the opportunities in each of the countries has been provided in the supplementary information that you guys have, but I guess I just wanted to give an overarching view on, from our experience over the last 8 years of working in the Pacific, what are the types of things that we really feel would work between PSP and the country programs. And the first, is the supply and demand model, which has worked. A really good example of that is our Tonga program. The Tonga program, the country programs has really worked with Ministries of Health and Ministries of Sport on working on creating demand for sport by highlighting how sport is really an important component to improving your health. And by communicating those messages to a wide audience in Tonga, they increased demand for sport. So more people were aware that sport was not just a recreational activity, that it was really important for their health. And that created demand which then needed to be met. And in this particular case, we used netball because the target group that we were using were women, and that women were disproportionately affected in health, that they had poorer health than males in Tonga, and they were less physically active. And netball was a game that was quite popular in Tonga, that we felt that we could build on the existing strengths, and to help women get more physically active. So what we did is we worked with the Ministries of Health and Ministries of Sport to build the capacity to do that communication to people about the health needs. And then we worked with Tonga Netball Association, who is a partner under PSP, to build their capacity to be able to meet the demand. Now, of course, it wasn't perfect. We learnt a lot of lessons from it. We did not expect the demand that we actually got. It was way beyond our capacity to service and TNA's capacity to service, but we've learnt from those lessons, and we know now that it's really important to have a strong federation in the country who's able to meet the demand that we're going to create through our communication activities. But for us at the country programs, we feel that that's the best way that the two programs can come together. Like Marty and Rob indicated, we want sport to stick to what it's really good at, and that's building participation and working on coaching and umpiring and on all your officiating, and we'll help with working on demand and access to rural areas. And I guess that's the third point I've got there is the increased reach that the country programs will be able to provide to sports is a great way of us partnering together. Solomon Islands and Vanuatu are really good examples. Solomon Islands, as I explained, we work with an NGO there, Save the Children, and they have an incredible footprint throughout Solomon Islands, and Solomon Islands are very remote and difficult places to get to. But Save the Children have a footprint in all of those, a lot of those communities throughout the Solomon Islands, that you're able to use those networks to increase your reach throughout the country. I guess I'm going to end up with just by saying how important it is for us to have a coordinated approach. We need to, these are small countries that we're working in, and with limited number of participants. Other than PNG, we're not talking about large populations. So it's important for us, there are 3 different investments in each of these countries. It's important for us to be able to coordinate those activities to make sure that we're not trying to duplicate activities, that we're not trying to work with the same group of participants, and that we're not confusing stakeholders. So we're really open to working with any of the sports that have some good ideas and how they'd like to work with us in the country programs. So the door is open. Come and speak to us if you want some more information. The supplementary information is there, put together to give you some ideas and some inspiration for what you might be able to do in each of the countries. But like I said, me and my team are open to hearing some ideas and seeing how they might be able to fit with our existing activities. Thank you.